All right, let's dive right into what is, no joke, one of the most high-stakes intellectual battles in early Christian history. But this isn't just some dusty old theological debate. It's a massive philosophical showdown over the very nature of God, of reality, and existence itself.
And it all kicks off with this huge question, one that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. If God is supposed to be perfect, eternal, completely unchanging, then how in the world does that being cause a universe that's constantly moving and changing? That's the big paradox we're going to unpack today.
And our guide through this whole puzzle is an absolutely brilliant 7th century thinker, a philosopher and theologian named Maximus the Confessor. We're pulling directly from his major work, The Ambigua, where he just takes on all the toughest theological questions of his day head on.
Okay, so before we can really get into the main event, the big debate, we have to get our heads around the philosophical foundation that Maximus is building on. And that is the idea of God as the unmoved mover, the first cause.
Maximus kicks things off with a principle that, just feels right. It makes sense. Everything that moves, everything that happens has to have a cause. A ball doesn't just start rolling by itself. Something had to push it. It really seems like this chain of cause and effect is what governs our entire reality.
Well, if you follow that chain of causes backwards, what caused this, and what caused that, and what caused that, you realize you can't just go on forever. It's not logical. There has to be a starting point, a first cause that kicked everything else into motion, but wasn't itself caused by anything before it. For Maximus, this is the divine.
And that brings us right back to our central problem, doesn't it? If God is the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, how does God actually do anything? How can something that doesn't move somehow move everything else?
And here's where Maximus comes in with this just beautiful solution. He says God doesn't move the world by pushing it, but by pulling it. The divine is the ultimate object of all desire, all love. It moves the entire universe just by being so completely good and beautiful that everything is drawn towards it, almost like a magnetic force. So it's an attraction, not an action.
Okay, so with that philosophical groundwork in place, now we can turn to the actual historical beef. Maximus was writing in response to a huge controversy that had shaken Christianity to its absolute core, a movement known as Arianism. So what was this Arianism thing all about? Well, at its heart, it was the belief that the Son, Jesus, wasn't eternal in the same way God the Father was. Instead, they argued he was the very first and the greatest of all creations, something brought into being by a specific decision, an act of the Father's will.
And you can kind of see how they got there, right? Their logic seems pretty straightforward. First, there's just the Father, existing alone. Then, at some point, the Father wills the Son to exist, and therefore the Son must have a beginning, which makes him a separate and, well, a lesser being than his Creator. This was the argument that Maximus had to completely dismantle.
And Maximus steps into the ring and meets this argument head-on with a truly brilliant counter-argument, completely reframing the relationship between God's will and the act of begetting.
The Arians were really hammering on this one simple idea. If the Son is a product of the Father's will, then there must have been a moment, a time, before that will was actually put into action.
And this, right here, is the absolute key distinction. The Arians saw a sequence. First comes the will, then comes the action. But Maximus argues that for a perfect, eternal being like God, there's no separation at all between willing something and that thing being true. For God, the will is the act. The begetting of the Son is a single, instantaneous, eternal event.
And to make this point, Maximus uses this fantastic analogy. Think about it. You can't have the act of seeing without someone who sees and something to be seen all happening at the exact same time. Well, in the same way, he argues, you can't have the act of begetting without a begetter, the Father, and the one who is begotten, the Son. They're totally inseparable parts of one single, simultaneous divine reality.
So the takeaway here is just huge. By completely collapsing the distinction between willing and acting when it comes to God, Maximus shows that the Son isn't a creation that happened in time. No, he is co-eternal with the Father, forever being begotten in a timeless, divine relationship.
All right, so that's the first Arian argument down, but there was another one, and this one was all about the word cause.
So the Arians came back with another point that, on the surface, makes a lot of sense. In our human world, a cause is always greater than its effect, right? A painter is greater than the painting.
So they asked, if the Father is the cause of the Son, doesn't that automatically make the Father superior?
But Maximus's response just blows a hole in their logic. He shows that the Arians are confusing two totally different kinds of causality. Yeah, for us humans, a cause often implies a hierarchy. But for God, Maximus says the word cause is just describing a relationship. The title Father doesn't mean he's superior, it just defines his eternal relationship to the Son.
I mean, this was their argument, laid out plain and simple. They were directly connecting the idea of causality to a hierarchy of nature, which, in their view, would make the Son a lesser being. And Maximus' counterpunch is so simple, but it's a knockout. He just cuts that link. He insists that within the Godhead, Father is a relational term, not a rank. It defines who the Father is in relation to the Son, not a difference in their shared divine being. Okay, I know that was some pretty heavy philosophy. So you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter? Well, it matters because these seemingly abstract arguments about words like cause and will literally became the foundation of Orthodox Christian belief.
This whole debate basically hammered out these core principles: that the Son is eternal, that the act of begetting is timeless, and that the relationship within the Godhead is one of perfect equality, not some kind of power ranking. This philosophical victory really shaped the next 1,000+ years of Christian thought.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. This entire debate was a struggle with language itself, an attempt to use our small, finite human words like Father and Son and cause to try and describe an infinite reality. And it really makes you wonder, when we talk about the ultimate nature of things, are our words a window that helps us see reality, or are they just a cage showing us the limits of our own minds?